The morning began with fog curling around the base of the hills, thick and slow like something reluctant to leave. The house sat high above the valley, a silhouette of power behind manicured hedges and wrought iron gates. Birds chirped in cautious rhythms, and the winding private road up to the estate sparkled with dew like the earth was bowing in silence. She arrived in a modest car, clean, reliable, unremarkable. The kind of car that blended into city traffic and disappeared behind hedge-lined drives. She parked in her usual spot, to the side of the kitchen entrance, never in the front where the guests arrived, never in the garage where the owner's luxury vehicles slept under silk covers. Inside, the house was still asleep. Expensive silence hung like perfume over every hallway. Only the old grandfather clock by the sitting room dared to breathe, ticking out the weight of expectation from its place beneath oil paintings and imported molding. She moved through the mansion like a memory, soft-footed, efficient, unquestioned. In the kitchen, she unpacked fresh fruit into glass bowls, reset the breakfast bar, wiped the edge of the countertop where the maid always missed. She checked the children's schedules one more time, printed out a copy for the driver, left reminders on the chalkboard wall beside the fridge. Upstairs, the children were beginning to stir. The youngest one, barely 5, had already begun his routine. One sock on, the other missing, tangled in a sheet or slipped beneath the rug. She'd find it later. She always did, because she remembered the things no one else thought to. She moved through their mornings not as an outsider, but as the quiet constant. Towel ready before they called for it, juice chilled to the right degree of cold, hair ties waiting on the corner of the sink. The parents, of course, were still in bed. Their lives ran late. Meetings, fundraisers, wine-fueled toasts to business deals negotiated in rooms where everyone knew each other by last name and tax bracket. They weren't cruel people, just busy, detached. They smiled in the way people do when they've forgotten how to connect without performance. She never blamed them, but she noticed, every time. By 8:30, the house had come alive. The chef arrived to prepare brunch. The gardener pulled into the drive with tools in tow. The house manager checked inventory lists and disappeared into the wine cellar. The day unfurled like it always did, predictable, polished, perfectly curated. And yet, none of it functioned without her. She was the quiet axis. The children trusted her more than anyone. The housekeepers deferred to her even when they weren't supposed to. Even the cook, an aging Frenchman with a short fuse and long memory, asked for her input on allergies and preferences. She carried the rhythm of the house in her head, who liked what, which door squeaked, what time the postman usually arrived. But none of them truly saw her. Not the way they saw each other. She wasn't a threat. She wasn't an asset. She was just the nanny. To them, that meant someone who could be kind without consequence, firm without power, always smiling, always grateful. But she had never asked to be seen. She had asked only for space, for stability, for a life where no one controlled the air she breathed or the roof above her head. And she had built it, inch by inch, dollar by dollar, sacrificing dinners, ignoring birthdays, investing instead in something no one else could touch. She had bought the house 3 years ago, quietly, through a trust. The former owners, burdened by divorce and debt, had needed to sell discreetly. She had been the only one who could pay in full. No loans, no questions, just clean money earned through years of other people's children, other people's houses, other people's lives. And when the papers were signed, she never changed a thing. She kept the same staff, kept the same routines, let the family stay. They rented now, though they didn't know it. They assumed the trust belonged to some faceless investor, some executive from overseas, a name in an account, a myth with a signature. And she let them believe that, because the truth would have done more damage than good. Because they weren't ready for it. And because her greatest strength had never been in shouting. It had always been in watching, waiting, owning silently. Afternoon came with the sound of distant tennis balls and the scent of lemon polish. The estate shimmered under the noon sun, every surface curated for elegance, every window catching the light in just the right way to convince outsiders that this life, this stillness, had always belonged to those who now lounged inside it. She moved among them like a shadow made of flesh and memory, Outside by the pool, the mother sipped something cold and bitter while scrolling through her phone. Inside, a housekeeper scrubbed at a marble counter that didn't look dirty. Upstairs, one of the children lay across the floor of the playroom, building a quiet universe out of plastic bricks and unspoken trust. That was where she went, where she always went. Not because she had to, because she wanted to. That child, like the others before, leaned on her not because she was assigned, but because she was reliable. Because when things broke, inside or out, she didn't panic. She just fixed them. Downstairs, the father took a call in his home office, pacing beneath a commissioned painting he hadn't liked but bought for appearances. His voice traveled through vents and open hallways, rising and falling with vague anger and words like leverage and portfolio and entitlement. She didn't need to hear specifics. The tone was familiar. She'd heard it for years. Men talking about control in places where they'd already lost it. That afternoon, a guest arrived. Not someone close. Not someone kind. A cousin of the wife. Visiting from out of state. Loud in his presence, unbothered by nuance, always a little too comfortable in other people's homes. The kind who introduced himself with his resume and smiled like the world was something owed to him. He brought laughter too big for the living room, questions too pointed for politeness, and commentary wrapped in jokes that didn't land. He was the type who noticed help only when he needed something. He saw her clearing dishes and assumed she'd been born to it. That her posture came from submission, not strength. That her quiet meant lesser. He cracked jokes about upward mobility. Asked how long she'd worked her way into the good graces of rich folks. Smirked like the world was an inside joke and he was the only one in on it. She didn't blink. She'd heard worse. When she excused herself, it wasn't retreat. It was preservation. Because dignity doesn't argue with ignorance. It simply outlasts it. The children noticed, though. They always did. They saw the way he dismissed her, the way he interrupted her when she spoke, the way he said her name like it was a burden. That night, when the guests had gone and the house returned to its curated quiet, one of them asked, carefully, cautiously, why he had spoken to her that way. She gave no lecture. She never did. She simply said that sometimes people mistake kindness for weakness. And sometimes they learn too late. The next morning, the cousin made a comment over breakfast. About ownership. About inheritance. About how some people just aren't cut out for the pressure of managing real property. The father laughed. The mother nodded. The children stared into their cereal like it might explain something. She poured orange juice and made note of the contractor's arrival later that day. Because unlike the man at the head of the table, she wasn't guessing about ownership. She had signed the papers. She'd paid the taxes. She had chosen the fixtures in the new West Wing remodel. Chosen them with the same care she used to choose textbooks for the children she raised while their parents entertained themselves into absence. No one suspected a thing. Because when people think you're beneath them, they stop looking up. Later that day, while the cousin lounged on the veranda and the mother explained to a friend over the phone how exhausting the help could be sometimes, she walked into the study. Opened a drawer behind the desk. Pulled out the envelope from the title company, still sealed, addressed to the trust. The embossed letters shone against the dark paper. She held it for a moment. Not because she needed to be reminded, but because some truths deserved to be touched now and then. The rain came late that evening, not in torrents, but in a soft, steady rhythm that blurred the windows and softened the hard lines of the estate. Thunder rolled in distant waves, not close enough to be threatening, just loud enough to remind the house that something outside of it still held power. Inside, everything remained in its place. Curated, staged, humming with illusion. She stood in the library, alone, lights dimmed. Her fingers trailing across the edge of a shelf lined with books whose pages had never been turned. She paused at one spine, a legal volume on estate law, and slid it gently back into alignment. That room had once been intimidating, not because of its content, but because of what it represented. She remembered dusting those shelves years ago, her wages late, her hours long, her dignity barely intact. She had cleaned this room with trembling hands and studied the world it pretended to hold. But now she moved through it differently, not because her name had changed, because her posture had. Earlier that day, the cousin had wandered into the parlor, drink in hand, making loud observations about the art on the walls. He asked questions in the way people do when they don't expect answers. What do you suppose a place like this costs to keep running? Who's in charge of all this? Do they know what they've got here? All rhetorical, all smug. He wasn't interested in the truth. He was performing superiority for his own comfort. And yet, truth sat 5 feet away, polishing the edges of a brass lamp. Not reacting, just listening, just remembering. The next morning, she reviewed the maintenance budget from the estate manager, quietly corrected a miscalculation, scheduled a repair for the fountain outside the east wing that had started leaking again, transferred funds from one holding account to another, accounts no one else in the house even knew existed. Not even the family, especially not them. She walked the perimeter of the house that afternoon, clipboard in hand. An annual inspection, not a chore, an exercise of care. The staff assumed she was reporting to someone, that she was gathering notes to pass along to the owners, that she was just the loyal nanny doing more than she was paid for. They were half right. She was always doing more than she was paid for. But she wasn't gathering notes for someone else. She was making decisions. Ownership, she had learned, wasn't always loud. Sometimes it lived in the fine print, in signatures others never saw, in contracts filed through layers of legal silence. She had built her privacy as carefully as she'd once folded other people's linens. Because she had learned early, those who flaunt wealth often borrowed it. Real power never introduces itself. That evening, while the family dined on the terrace, she was in the study once more. Not cleaning, not tidying, working, reviewing a portfolio of properties, one of which they currently occupied. Her attorney had emailed a reminder that the tenant's lease was up for renewal in 60 days. A decision would be needed soon. Raise the rate? Extend? Reclaim the home? She didn't answer yet. The rain started again as night fell. The cousin complained about the weather ruining the view, muttered something about the gardener's incompetence and the food being overseasoned. He asked why they hadn't hired a better class of help. No one corrected him. No one challenged him. But the room went still, because some words, once spoken, can't be unsaid. The children were quieter that night. One of them lingered by the stairs, watching her as she turned off the lights. He asked no questions, just stared, as if trying to solve a puzzle the adults had never noticed existed. Upstairs, she stood by the window and watched the clouds drift like shadows with secrets. Below her, the house glowed in warm tones, perfect from a distance, fragile up close. She touched the glass with one hand, not in longing, in recognition. She had once dreamed of homes like this. Now she owned one, and the people inside had no idea they were living on borrowed time. The days that followed were dry again. Blue skies, trimmed hedges, sunlight bouncing off the pool tiles like a commercial for stability. The house resumed its rituals. Yoga mats unrolled at dawn. Fresh juice pressed by machines more expensive than the appliances in most homes. Music piped gently through recessed ceiling speakers. An illusion restored. But something had shifted beneath the surface. The cousin stayed longer than planned. He claimed to be handling business remotely, but he lingered like smoke in a room not meant for him. He moved through the house with familiarity that wasn't earned and ownership that wasn't his. His words were louder, his assumptions firmer, his gaze hungrier. She noticed, not the volume of his presence but the shape of it, where he placed his shoes, how he spoke to the staff. The way he leaned too close when asking questions that weren't really questions. How he called her by the wrong name, again and again, as if to remind her that she didn't deserve the right one. He asked her one morning, loud enough for the others to hear, if she ever thought about getting out of this line of work. He laughed as he said it, like it was kindness, like she needed the idea planted, as if her life hadn't been chosen with more care than any career he'd ever failed upward into. She smiled and continued folding the linen napkins into neat, perfect triangles. That evening, the children found her in the reading room, where she always went when the world upstairs became too heavy with noise. They brought a board game and 2 cups of cocoa from the kitchen. They didn't ask to be there. They simply came. Because where she was, there was safety, predictability, something grounded in a world of drifting adults. She let them stay until their eyes got heavy and the house grew quiet again. Upstairs, the cousin laughed with the father, clinking glasses, discussing property and investments, as if either understood risk beyond theory. He spoke about houses he'd seen, real estate ventures that had gone sideways, joked about stupid people making big moves with no idea what they owned. She passed them later, unnoticed. To them, she was noise in the background. Air conditioning, furniture, warmth without identity. But the deed in her safe told a different story. The home office was quiet late that night. She unlocked it with her own key, sat at the desk, turned on the lamp, reviewed the lease contract line by line. Rent due, conditions met, minor infractions noted by the house manager, delays in maintenance, one missed fee, damage to the garden gate. None of it enough to evict, all of it enough to decide. She closed the folder and looked around the room. Every object had a price tag, every inch accounted for by someone else's taste. But none of it held memory. None of it had been earned by sweat or compromise. It was a showroom of borrowed elegance. She stood slowly, walked out, and left the door slightly ajar. The next morning, she received a call from her attorney. Routine, but timely. They discussed renewal options, market evaluations, whether to offer a second term on the lease or take the property back. She gave no answer. She needed no time. She simply asked for the file to be updated and the first draft of a termination letter to be prepared. Not immediately. 60 days. Enough for courtesy. Not enough for control. That afternoon, the cousin made one last comment. Something careless. Something small. Something that said more about him than he realized. He laughed, called her sweet, asked if she'd ever thought about writing a tell-all. Said he'd read it if it had pictures. She didn't look up. She just continued clearing the table. But that night, the children left a note folded under her bedroom door. A drawing. Picture of the house. Their house. With her standing in the doorway, bigger than the building itself, smiling. They didn't know the truth. Not yet. But they saw it more clearly than any adult ever had. And one day, when they were old enough, she'd tell them everything. Not to shame the others, but to remind them that power isn't volume. It's presence. The calendar moved forward without ceremony. Days ticked off in the slow rhythm of late summer, the kind of time that passes softly but leaves marks anyway. The mansion pulsed with its usual patterns, brunch served under filtered skylight, yoga sessions streamed on tablets, imported flower deliveries standing tall in glass vases untouched by hands that paid for them. She continued her routines as always. Morning walks along the stone path behind the garden. Scheduling the pest control visit for the East Wing. Updating the spreadsheet for utilities. She filed receipts. Coordinated vendor invoices. Paid staff early when needed. And no one questioned her. They'd grown so used to her efficiency, her silence, her structure, they didn't realize it had become governance. The cousin remained. His presence no longer amusing, not even to the hosts who had once laughed at his every offhand insult. He lingered around like a guest who refused to leave, always in someone's space, always assuming authority. He had started making comments about the property's potential. Talked of flipping it, renovating it, opening it up for investors. He walked around the estate with a phone camera in hand, filming walkthroughs, muttering numbers to himself. He believed he was positioning himself for opportunity. He didn't know he was standing in someone else's house. She watched him from the second-floor balcony one morning. He stood below, speaking loudly into a phone call, pointing toward the West Wing, describing the lot's size as if it belonged to him. His voice carried through the open atrium. She stood still, calm, one hand resting lightly on the carved railing. That evening, the house manager delivered a thick white envelope to her room. Inside, the revised termination letter from the legal team. Final version. Reviewed, approved, ready to send. She folded it once, sealed it back in the envelope, placed it in her drawer beside a box of keepsakes no one had ever seen. The following day, the cousin asked her a question. Something smug. Something soaked in assumption. He pointed at a painting and asked what she thought it was worth. Before she could respond, he guessed too low, then too high. Then he laughed and said it didn't matter, that nothing in this place really belonged to the people in it. That wealth was just a game of proximity. He was half right. But what he didn't understand was the difference between proximity and permanence. That night, she sat on the back patio after everyone else had gone to bed. The lights were low. The air still. She listened to the wind through the trees, the quiet creak of the gate at the far end of the garden path. Somewhere down the hill, a set of sprinklers hissed into life. The rhythm calmed her. She had lived too long in silence to fear solitude. Inside, the children slept. Safe. Comfortable. She had seen them grow into themselves in rooms they thought were gifts from their parents. She had stayed up through their fevers, soothed their anxieties, cleaned up after their failures. She had taught them more than anyone else in the house had ever realized. But she had never told them everything. Not yet. Not until it mattered. When she went to bed that night, she left the envelope on the edge of her desk. Not hidden. Not flaunted. Just there. Because the clock was ticking. And when the moment came, it would not be dramatic. It would be written. Sealed. Delivered. And irreversible. The morning arrived with clarity. No fog. No wind. Just sunlight stretching across the marble floors in long, golden ribbons. It was the kind of day the family loved, when the weather made everything look like it had been airbrushed. Breakfast was served under the terrace awning. The children played quietly on the lawn. The cousin took calls on the veranda, pacing in tailored shorts and designer sunglasses, still speaking like a man poised to inherit something. She moved through the home as she always did, unhurried, unnoticed, necessary. But something was different. She wore a navy blazer that day, not her usual soft layers. Her shoes clicked more than they padded. She moved not like a caretaker, but like someone taking inventory of something she already owned. Because she was. In the study, the envelope waited. Crisp. White. Immaculate. It sat on the desk where the family usually kept birthday cards and unread bank statements. This time, it contained a truth that could no longer be delayed. The lease termination letter, now formal. The signature final. The timeline precise. 60 days. No renewals. No appeals. No discussion. The mansion would be returned to its rightful owner. And they would leave it not because she forced them to, but because they had never truly belonged to it in the first place. She placed the envelope at the center of the desk and left the door ajar. Not wide enough to invite, but just open enough for curiosity to draw someone in. She didn't stand by. She didn't wait. She returned to her routines because the real work was already done. Later that afternoon, the mother entered the study and saw it. Her footsteps slowed. Her breath caught. She opened the envelope with one hand and steadied herself with the other. Her eyes scanned the letter once, twice, 3 times. She didn't call for anyone. Didn't cry out. Just stood still, reading a truth too clean to argue. When the father came in later, there was no exchange. Just the passing of the paper between them. He read it in silence, the weight of it folding into his shoulders, into the memory of the things he hadn't seen, hadn't questioned. The power he'd assumed was his. The home he'd believed he controlled. Upstairs, the cousin packed without asking. Without jokes. Without posturing. He left before dinner, citing work obligations, his tone suddenly brittle. He didn't say goodbye. The children didn't ask questions that night, though their eyes said everything. She sat with them a little longer before bed, her hands smoothing out the blankets with care. One of them left a drawing on her nightstand, another picture of the house, only this time she stood at the center of it, not the doorway. Alone. Smiling. Stronger than the roof above her. 2 days later, the family requested a meeting. They sat at the table like guests. Which at last, they truly were. They didn't yell. They didn't beg. They asked questions in soft voices. Why now? What changed? Where would they go? She answered none of them. Not because she was cruel. Because some answers are earned, not given. They left in early September. The moving trucks arrived in silence. The house grew quieter by degrees. The walls no longer echoed with assumptions. The air felt lighter. When the doors finally closed behind them, she stood in the foyer alone. Not triumphant. Not mournful. Just present. Entirely present. She walked through each room. Touched every banister. Opened windows that hadn't been opened in years. She wasn't reclaiming anything. She was restoring balance. The home no longer held illusions. Now it held her truth. That evening, she sat on the back patio with a cup of tea and the deed beside her. Not because she needed to look at it, but because it was hers, and some things deserve acknowledgement even after they've been won. She didn't invite new tenants. Didn't replace the family with another. She let the house breathe. Let herself breathe. For once, without carrying anyone else's weight. The next morning, she walked through the garden barefoot. The grass was cold, but clean. The sun caught her shoulders and didn't let go. And in that moment, no one could say otherwise. She was not the help. She was not the story told in whispers. She was not a footnote in someone else's empire. She was the owner. The architect of her own peace. And finally, the world would move in a house built entirely on her terms.